Hi there, folks. Today we're looking at populations and samples, and really we're just going to define these things. We're going to identify what represents the population, what represents the sample, in different examples of how we might conduct a study. But really, this is part of that broader discussion of how is data collected. Okay, and that's what we're going to get into as we move forward here. You know, we've talked a little bit about analyzing certain values when we're looking at data sets. Analyzing data sets in terms of the shape and the consistency in terms of standard deviation, that kind of stuff. But now we're going to look at, well, how do we actually collect data? All right. And so the first thing we're going to look at here, the population. The population is the entire group that we want to study. And that idea of this is what we want to study. Okay. We might not be able to study every person or everything or everyone in the population, but this is the group we want information about. All right. The sample is the group that we actually do study, that we actually conduct, like the surveys that we actually conduct, the interviews and those kind of things. It's where we're actually collecting the data from. So it's a group from the population for which we collect data. All right. And, there's lots of reasons that we use samples instead of the population. The main reason is most of the time it's not feasible to collect data from the entire population, to get everybody in the population. Even if it's a small population, with a small population, even sometimes then it's difficult to make sure you get the data collected from everybody. And if you miss one or two people, well, then now really you're technically looking at a sample from that population. Most of the time, populations are so large and so diverse that we can't necessarily hit everybody in the population all at once. We have to look at samples that hopefully represent the population well. Okay. For example, here we want to identify the population and the sample for each. And so here's the situation. York Suburban High School wants to study the employment habits of students. So we want to study the employment habits of York Suburban High School students, and we're going to select the school randomly selects 100 students to participate in an interview. All right, because we want to know, hey, what are students doing in terms of part-time jobs and that kind of stuff? What are their work habits? Their employment habits outside of school. And so when you look at this, the fact that it's York Suburban wants to study its particular students, all right, it's not like they're looking for broader populations in terms of teens across the United States. They're looking at just York Suburban students. So when you look at this, the population this time, the population is going to be York Suburban High School students. That is the entire group we want information about. We want to know about all high school students in terms of their employment habits and that kind of stuff. All right. Now, again, we could try sending out a survey to the entire group, but that might be difficult. And maybe we want more specific information than what a survey is going to give us. So we want to conduct interviews, and it would be difficult to interview everybody from the population, to interview every high school student at York Suburban. So what we've done now is we've collected, we've randomly selected 100 students to participate in interviews. So those 100 students, that is our sample. Okay. So the sample is the 100 students being interviewed. Okay. So that's the idea. We want to know something about all York Suburban High School students. We use a chunk of that population in order to get an idea of what the whole population might be like. This one, a researcher wants to study the homework habits of U.S. teens. And so the researcher randomly selects 300 students from a local high school to participate in a survey. And so once again, the population, the thing that we want to gather information about is basically the homework habits of U.S. teens. So teenagers across the United States is the population that we're trying to investigate. Okay, so the population that we're trying to investigate is United States teenagers. Okay. The people that we're actually getting the data from, or this research is actually getting the data from, the sample that they're using, is the 300 students from that local high school. Okay. So 300 local high school students. Okay, so who we want to study is teens across the United States. Who we're actually their data from is the 300 local high school students. This one, York Suburban High School wants to study students' perceptions of their learning experience. So the school surveys every student in each of Dr. Jansen's classes. And so once again, we're trying to gather the perception of York Suburban students in terms of their learning experience. So the population this time, a little bit smaller than the last one. The population this time is York Suburban High School students again. Okay, it's not the entire population across the United States because that's not what's stated here. We're looking at just York Suburban students. And to figure out what's going on with them, we sampled all the students from one teacher's particular classes. Okay, and it happens to be me. All right, so Dr. J's students. Okay, that's the sample. So what we want to know information about is all York Suburban High School students. What we gather data from is all of Dr. Jansen's students. Okay. The next thing we want to kind of look at as we look at populations and how surveys are conducted, we want to know if there's issues with the way these are being conducted, okay? And so there's lots of different factors that we're going to kind of take a look at when we look at the sample and the population. First of all, we want to make sure that the sample is representative of the population, okay? In other words, does the sample actually come from the population we're trying to study, all right? That's one thing we'll look at. We'll look at, did we study enough people? You know, when you look at something like York Suburban High School, we don't need to study nearly as many students when we're only looking at a population of York Suburban High School as if we're looking at teens across the entire United States. Well, now we're talking about millions of people. You know, conducting 20 interviews isn't going to be enough for something like that. Okay. So the size of the sample relative to the size of the population is going to be important. But then one of the other big factors here is this idea of bias. Okay. Is there something in here? Are there factors that might influence the data that's being collected? All right. And bias comes up in a bunch of different places. That's not the only issue that we face here. But one of the big issues we face is going to be bias. All right. Is there something that's either negatively or positively influencing the outcome? Any influence on the data is going to be considered bias. Okay. And sometimes we look for bias that a company is conducting their own surveys and they want to influence this thing positively to make it look like their product or their company is better than it is. Okay. Or maybe someone else is taking surveys about something they dislike. And so they try to lead survey results towards negative outcomes. Okay. So bias are these factors that might influence the data. Okay. And so if we look at something like this, it says determine if each sample would be representative of the population. In other words, is this a good sample? All right. Does the sample necessarily represent the population or could it represent the population? Are there any issues? And so that's the big thing. We're going to look for issues here. So some of the same examples. So YSHS wants to study the employment habits of students. The school randomly selects 100 students to participate in an interview. All right. And so when you look at this, first of all, we're going to look at, all right, does the sample actually, is that sample actually part of the population we're trying to study? And so if we're randomly selecting 100 students to participate in interviews, well, yeah, those 100 students are part of the York Suburban High School students that we're trying to gather data about. So one, there's not an issue there in terms of do these things match up? The sample comes from the population. That's the first thing we want to look at. Okay, so gold star there. All right. The next thing we want to look at is, size. All right. Is 100 students a big enough sample when we're only looking at York Suburban High School students? And when you think about it, York Suburban High School, we have maybe somewhere around 1,000 kids that attend the high school. And so looking at that, that's 10% of the population. That's a decent chunk of the population. So I don't have any issue with 100 in terms of how that compares to the overall population. Okay, if it was 100 compared to the world population, then 100 is way too small when you're comparing it to billions of people. Okay, so when we look at this thing, So the sample is part of the population. That's the first thing we look at. So the sample is part of the population. 100 is a big enough sample size. And then the last thing we look at, is there any bias? When we look at the idea of bias here, like, we don't see anything. There's nothing jumping off the page here. If there's not anything jumping off the page, then it probably means that there's not really any bias here. Okay, are we somehow influencing the results, influencing the data in the way we're collecting the data? And in this case, we're randomly selecting 100 students. And typically, when you randomly select things, there's not nearly as much of an issue when we talk about bias. So I would say that there appears to be no bias. So with all of those things considered, I asked the question, well, is this a representation of the overall population? Would those 100 students be a good representation of the population? I would say yes for this one. Okay. Yes, the sample is representative. It's because we looked at all those factors. Okay. If we look at the next one, it says a researcher wants to study the homework habits of U.S. teens. The researcher randomly selects 300 students from a local high school to participate in a survey. And so, again, we look through this idea that, first of all, would those students be part of the population that we're trying to investigate? And the answer is yes, okay? Those 300 students, that sample is part of the overall population, okay? So sample is part of population. Okay, that's the first thing we look at. All right. The next thing we look at is the size, 300 students. So 300 students out of a total population. When we look at the total population of U.S. teens, it's going to be millions of students. All right. And so when we look at that, 300 is not a very big chunk of that population. It's a super small chunk of that population. So I would look at this and say, well, 300 isn't nearly enough. Okay. So 300 is not a big enough sample. Okay. Okay, so that's the first issue we encounter. And then the last thing we look at is in terms of bias. When we look at something like this, because the researcher's only collecting 300 students from one local high school, that is going to impact the results. It's going to influence the results because really the students at that high school might all have similar study habits. And, are we talking about a high achieving high school or a low achieving high school? Okay, where do they rank in terms of the state we're even talking about? And where do different states rank when we compare these things? If you look at 300 students from a low achieving high school in a low achieving state, it's going to be a lot different than if we look at a high achieving high school in a high achieving state. Okay. And so that is going to influence the results. So I would say there's bias in these results because we're looking at only one high school. Okay. Bias, and I'm going to say because we're looking at a narrow section of the population. Let me abbreviate it this way. Narrow because narrow sample. Okay. That just means we need to kind of broaden our horizons a little bit. We're only looking at a very specific group of students. Okay. So it's a very narrow sample when we're only looking at students from that one high school. Okay. So the idea here is, now I would say this one is not representative. The sample is not very good in this one. Okay. This one, YSHS wants to study students' perceptions of their learning experiences. So once again, we're looking at a population of the YSHS students. The school surveys every student in each of Dr. Jansen's classes. And so once again, are those students part of the population? The answer is yes. So Once again, the students are part of the population, so the sample is part of the population. Okay, so that's the first thing we look at. When we look at the sample size, if we look at all of my classes, I have anywhere from 100 to 130, 140 students each year. So we're looking at something around 100 to 140 students, we'll say. And so when you kind of look at that, yeah, that should be a pretty decent sample size considering there's only about 1,000 students in the high school. Okay, and so I would say the sample size is big enough. So big enough sample size. Okay. And the last thing, that idea of bias, well, if I want to know the learning experience of students across the high school, is it biased to only look at my classes, to only look at Dr. Jansen's classes? And I would say, yes, it is biased. There is bias here because, of course, every single student who has Dr. Jansen is going to say that their learning experience is phenomenal. You know what I mean? Because they have the greatest math teachers ever lived. And that's, so that's really not fair to only ask my students, because of course they're going to say, yeah, learning here is amazing. Okay. So once again, we're looking at a very narrow section of the population. All right. Of course, they're going to say that, yes, my learning experiences are amazing. They have me. All right. And so it's bias in that sense that we're only looking at a narrow section of the population. So I'm going to say no. The sample is not representative of the overall population. Okay. And the last one here, a restaurant wants to determine if different menu items will attract new customers. The restaurant surveys every 5th customer for a period of 3 weeks. Okay. So for 3 weeks, they survey every 5th customer. All right. And so the first thing we ask ourselves is that sample part of the population? And so this one's a little bit tricky. When you look at this, the population they're trying to gather data about would be new customers. Okay. And the sample, when they're conducting the sample, they are surveying existing customers. Okay. When you look at that, they're surveying existing customers for 3 weeks. Well, if we're surveying existing customers, but we want data about new customers, the new customers we're trying to attract, is that sample part of the population? Well, the answer is no. Okay. We're sampling from something that we're not even trying to collect data about. So in this one, the sample is not part of the population. We want information about new customers, and we're surveying old customers. Okay. And so right away, this is not going to be a good representation. I don't even have to do the other things here. When you think about it, like the sample size will probably be big enough. So I'm guessing we would probably get a big enough sample if we did this for 3 weeks. And the nice thing is they could expand that a little bit if they didn't get enough in terms of their sample. Okay. But again, it's doomed from the start. In terms of bias, really, there's not really a way to determine the bias here. I don't think there's bias in terms of the way they're conducting this. It almost seems like bias because they're interviewing their own, or they're surveying their own customers, but really that's just them missing the sample and not aligning that with the population. Okay, so I wouldn't say there's any evidence of bias per se, but it's the thing is they're not interviewing or sampling the right people. Okay. So appear to be no bias. But again, this one was due from the start. No, this one is not representative. And it's because their sample isn't even part of the population they're trying to study. Okay. You got to make sure that the sample is part of the population you're trying to study. We have to make sure that the sample is big enough, and we got to make sure that it's free from bias. Okay.